Life is meant to be lived with eyes wide open, but there are days when the sky darkens and we'd rather close them forever. The day they killed my mother from the inside, they killed a part of me too. The difference is, I survived to tell this story. Good morning, my dear ones. This is Grandma Janet, 78 years well lived, with some wrinkles from worry, but many more from smiles, you know? I was born in 1947 in Salem, Oregon, in a time when we barely had proper electricity. Today is the first time I'm going to tell this complete story. This story I've kept buried deep in my chest for over 60 years. Oh, my dear ones, before I begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching this video from. Are you from California? From Texas? Or maybe even from Canada? I want to get to know each one of you. And if you could leave that like and subscribe to the channel, this grandma here would be very happy. It gives me strength to keep telling these stories that sometimes hurt, but might help someone going through something similar. I'd also love to know how old you are. Comment below. Now let's get to what matters. My mother, Jacqueline, was the most beautiful woman in Salem. Nobody had any doubt about that. Black hair, straight, long down to her waist. Green eyes, so rare back then that people said she had cat eyes. And a smile, my children. A smile that lit up the whole block. Our house was simple, but cozy. It was near the textile mill where my father, Jack, worked. We were a small family, me, my mother, my father, and my older brother, James, who was 7 years older than me. Our life wasn't easy, but Mom made everything seem like a celebration. I remember, as if it were yesterday, her kitchen. It didn't have these modern conveniences of today, no. It was a wood-burning stove, a solid wood table that my father had made, and an old cabinet that she always kept well organized. Every Saturday, she made a cornbread with anise that made your mouth water just from smelling the aroma spreading through the house. "Janet, come help your mother," she'd call, and I'd come running, happy as could be to be near her. I was kind of clumsy. Still am, let's face it. But she had the patience of a saint. "Not like that, honey. Look, it's slowly, with care," she'd say, while teaching me to knead the bread dough. Mom worked as a seamstress, taking orders from the wealthy ladies in town. She'd stay up late at night, hunched over that Singer sewing machine, pedaling non-stop. Sometimes, when she thought I was already asleep, I'd hear her cough. A dry, harsh cough that she tried to muffle with a cloth so as not to wake anyone. Today I know that cough was already the beginning of the end, but back then, who could have imagined? Mom had a special way of telling stories. At night, when she finished work, she'd sit on the edge of my bed and tell me tales of Paul Bunyan, of Bigfoot, and of Native American legends. I'd pretend to be scared just so she'd hug me and say, "You don't need to be afraid, my daughter. As long as I'm here, nothing bad will happen to you." Oh, how I wish that were true. The best memories I have are from Sundays. It was the only day Mom didn't work. In the morning, we'd go to church. She was very Methodist, never missed a service. Then we'd come home, where she'd prepare a special lunch. In the afternoon, when the heat died down, she'd take me to the town square. There was a gazebo where sometimes a small band would play, and we'd sit listening to music, eating popcorn. It was on one of those Sunday afternoons that we met Mrs. Teresa. She had just moved to Salem, coming from Portland. She was a teacher, spoke beautifully, wore colorful dresses that caught attention. Mom and she hit it off right away. Soon, Mrs. Teresa was a constant visitor at our house, having coffee, helping Mom with the more difficult sewing, bringing me books. "This girl is intelligent, Jacqueline," she'd tell my mother. "She needs to study. Go far." Mom would smile, proud. "God willing, she'll be somebody in life. She won't have to end up like me, hunched over a sewing machine until dawn." It was a beautiful dream, but life has a cruel way of interrupting dreams, doesn't it? In the winter of 1960, when I was 13, Mom's cough got worse. It wasn't just at night, hidden anymore. It was all the time, day and night, and there was blood. I saw her washing the cloths in the sink, trying to hide it from everyone, but I knew. Her face, which had always been rosy, became pale, almost transparent. Her dresses began to hang loose on her body that was getting thinner each day. "It's nothing, honey," she'd say when I asked. "It's just a bad flu that won't go away." But it wasn't flu. It was tuberculosis. Back then, it was almost a death sentence, especially for those who didn't have money for treatment. Dad didn't want to know. "It'll pass," he'd say, without even looking at her properly. He was never an affectionate man, but he wasn't bad either. At least not until then. He worked hard, brought money home, didn't drink much. But he had a closed, quiet way about him. James, my brother, was his favorite. The two were alike not just in appearance, but in personality too. Mom got worse each day. It got to a point where she couldn't get out of bed anymore. That's when Mrs. Teresa took action. Without telling anyone, she brought a doctor friend of hers to see Mom. I'll never forget the doctor's face after examining Mom. He left the room, called Mrs. Teresa and my father aside, and spoke quietly, as if he didn't want me to hear. But I heard. "It's very advanced. She'd need to be hospitalized." But even then, a matter of weeks, maybe days. My world collapsed in that moment. I was only 13, but I understood perfectly what that meant. My mother was dying, and there was nothing anyone could do. The days that followed were a nightmare in slow motion. Mom wasting away in that bed, getting weaker each day. Me sitting beside her, holding her hand, watching life slip through her fingers. Dad hardly showed up at home, stayed at work late, then went to the bar. James came and went, restless, nervous, as if Mom's illness was an inconvenience in his life. It was Mrs. Teresa who took care of everything. She came every day, brought medicine to ease the pain, ready-made food, and most importantly, affection and dignity in my mother's final days. One night, Mom called me close. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Janet, my daughter, Mom has to go. But I want you to know something. You were the greatest joy of my life. Never forget that." I tried to say she wasn't going anywhere, that she'd get better, but the words stuck in my throat. Deep down, I knew it was a lie. "When I'm no longer here," she continued, "look for Teresa. She promised to watch over you." I didn't really understand what she meant by that at the time. Why would I need Mrs. Teresa if I had my father and my brother? But Mom, even sick, even dying, could see what I couldn't see. The next morning, July 17th, 1960, I found Mom very quiet in bed. I called, shook her gently, but she didn't respond. She had departed during the night, alone, in silence, as she had lived most of her life. The scream that came from my throat woke the entire neighborhood. Dad came running, still smelling of whiskey from the night before. When he saw the scene, he fell to his knees beside the bed, finally showing some emotion. Mrs. Teresa arrived soon after. She was the one who organized everything, the coffin, the wake in our living room, as was customary back then, the simple burial in the town cemetery. She was the one who held me when they threw dirt over Mom's coffin, when I felt I wanted to be down there too, next to her. We returned home after the burial, a house that no longer seemed the same without Mom's presence. The silence was deafening. Mrs. Teresa wanted to stay with me, but Dad said it wasn't necessary, that family business is resolved within the family. She hugged me tight, whispered in my ear that she'd come back the next day, and left, leaving me alone with my father and my brother. That's when the real nightmare began. But that I'll tell in the next part of this story, my dear ones, because there are things we need to catch our breath before remembering. The memories of my mother are like a patchwork quilt. Each colored piece brings back a moment, a smile, a lesson she taught me. And even after so much time, the longing still squeezes my chest in a way that hurts. But as she always said, we cry what we need to cry, then dry our tears and move forward. And that's what I did, my loves. I moved forward, even when it seemed impossible. I think there are wounds that never completely heal. They just go numb with time. And this part of my story is the deepest wound I carry. But I promised to tell everything, didn't I? So here we go. That night after Mom's burial, the house felt like a tomb. Cold, silent, as if its soul had been ripped away along with Mom's departure. I was in my room, lying in bed, my eyes swollen from crying so much. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't even breathe properly from so much pain. Around 9 at night, I heard footsteps in the hallway. My bedroom door opened, and there was my father. I thought maybe he had come to console me, something he had never done before. Maybe Mom's death had awakened some kind of paternal feeling in him. But one look at his face was enough to know something was very wrong. His eyes were red, not from crying, but from drinking. The smell of whiskey was so strong you could smell it even with him standing at the door. In his hands, he held a half-empty bottle. "It was you," he said, his voice slurred, loaded with a hatred I had never seen before. "It was because of you that she got sick." I froze in bed, not really understanding what was happening. What did I do, Dad?" I managed to ask, my voice trembling. "You were born," he yelled, entering the room and slamming the door behind him. "If it weren't for you, she wouldn't have had to work so hard. You and your demands, always wanting new clothes, new notebooks, different food. That made no sense at all. I had never been a demanding child. On the contrary, I always understood our situation, always accepted the little we had with gratitude, but it was useless to argue. In his head, clouded by drink and distorted grief, I was to blame. "Dad, I didn't finish the sentence. I felt the impact of his hand on my face, so hard that I fell off the bed. Never in all my 13 years had my father raised his hand to me. Mom would never have allowed it, but Mom was no longer there to protect me. I tried to get up, but he pushed me back to the floor. I saw something in his eyes that chilled me inside. It wasn't just anger. It was something more, something I couldn't identify at the time, but that today, looking back, I recognize as desire, a sick desire, mixed with hatred and grief. "Now you're going to pay," he said, and began to unbuckle his belt. I closed my eyes, thinking I was going to get beaten. It would be bad, but I'd endure it. That's not what he had in mind. My dear ones, there are things that are difficult to tell even after so much time. I'll say what's necessary for you to understand what happened, but I apologize if my voice fails a little. I felt the weight of his body on mine, immobilizing me. I felt rough hands tearing my clothes, touching parts of my body that no one had ever touched. I screamed, but he covered my mouth with his hand, muffling any sound. "Shut up," he ordered. "Nobody's going to hear you anyway. I fought with all the strength I had. But what could a 13-year-old girl do against a grown man?" I closed my eyes and tried to transport myself somewhere else. Away from there, close to my mother, anywhere that wasn't that room, that moment. When I thought the nightmare was over, the door opened again. For a second, I had hope. Maybe some neighbor had heard something. Maybe it was Mrs. Teresa coming back to see how I was. But it was James, my older brother, whom I had always seen as a protector, even if distant. He stood at the door, looking at the scene. Me half naked on the floor, crying, Dad composing himself. "Dad? What's happening here?" For a brief moment, I thought he would help me, that he would stop that madness, call the police, do anything. Dad looked at him, then at me, and said something I'll never forget. "She killed your mother, James. This pest killed your mother." I saw my brother's face transform. The initial confusion gave way to a rage that mirrored Dad's. He looked at me, not as if I were his little sister, but as if I were a demon who had taken away the person he loved most in the world. "It's true," he said, his voice loaded with hatred. "If it weren't for you, she'd still be here." What happened next is like a horror movie playing in slow motion in my memory. The two of them, father and son, united not by love, but by hatred directed at me. United by the pain of loss they didn't know how to process, and which they decided to take out on the easiest, most vulnerable target, me. They took turns with my body as if I were nothing, as if I weren't human, as if I weren't daughter and sister. The physical pain was unbearable, but even worse was the pain of being betrayed by the people who should protect me. At some point, I lost consciousness. Maybe it was a defense mechanism of my mind, unable to process so much horror. When I woke up, I was alone in the room. Through the window, I saw it was already morning. My whole body hurt. There was blood on the sheet, on my torn clothes, on my thighs. I tried to get up, but couldn't. Every movement was agony. I heard voices coming from the kitchen. They were having breakfast as if nothing had happened, as if they hadn't destroyed a child's life the night before. I dragged myself to the bathroom, cleaned myself as I could with cold water, put on a clean dress that I could barely button with hands so shaky. Then I went back to the room and lay down again. I didn't know what to do, where to go, who to turn to. It was in this state that I spent the next 2 days, lying, motionless, alternating between consciousness and unconsciousness, between silent tears and an emptiness that seemed endless. I didn't eat, barely drank water. I just kept staring at the ceiling, wishing to die, wishing that unbearable pain would end somehow. They left in the morning and only returned at night. They left me alone all day, as if I were a broken object not worth fixing. Sometimes I'd hear Dad passing through the hallway, stopping at my bedroom door, then moving on. I trembled with fear, just thinking he might come in again. On the 3rd day after Mom's burial, I heard a knock on the front door. It was morning. Dad and James had already left for work. I didn't answer. I had no strength or will. More knocks, more insistent. Then a key turning in the lock. Someone was entering the house. I curled up in bed, terrified, thinking maybe they had come back early. "Janet? Are you there, child?" It was Mrs. Teresa's voice. My heart raced. Mom had said to look for her, but I didn't even need to. She came to me. "Janet?" I heard her footsteps going through the house, opening doors, looking for me. When she finally opened my bedroom door, I tried to hide under the blanket, ashamed, afraid she'd see what had happened to me. "Dear God!" she exclaimed upon seeing me. "What happened to you, child?" I couldn't answer. The words wouldn't come out. Just tears, which returned with full force when I saw that woman's worried face who had been my mother's best friend. She approached, sat on the edge of the bed, touched my forehead as if to see if I had a fever. Then, carefully, she pulled the blanket I was holding so tightly. What she saw must have been shocking. The bruises on my arms, on my face, the dress barely buttoned, revealing more marks on my chest. The blood-stained sheet that I didn't have the strength to change. "Who did this to you?" she asked, her voice trembling with rage and horror. "Was it your father? Was it James?" I nodded, unable to say the words aloud. "Both of them?" she insisted, needing to understand the extent of the horror. I nodded again, and I saw tears in her eyes, tears of rage, of sadness, of helplessness. "Your mother feared this might happen," she said quietly, more to herself than to me. "That's why she asked me to watch over you. That's why she gave me a copy of the key. She knew those two better than anyone." It was like a lightning bolt of understanding had hit me. Mom knew. Somehow, she knew what Dad and James were capable of. Maybe she had seen signs that I, in my child's innocence, couldn't perceive. And in her final moments of life, her greatest fear wasn't dying, but what would happen to me after she was gone. "We're leaving here right now," Mrs. Teresa decided, already standing up. "Will they be back at the end of the day?" I nodded, finding strength to finally speak. "Please don't leave me alone." "Never again," she promised, holding my hands. "You'll never be alone with them again. I'll take care of you as I promised your mother." She helped me get up, take a bath, put on clean clothes. She took some of my few things, clothes, my mother's portrait that was on the bedside table, my documents that Mom kept in a little box. "We're going to my house now," she said, while supporting me outside. "There you'll be able to rest, recover, then we'll decide what to do." Little did I know that was just the beginning of a much longer journey. That leaving that house was just the first step to escape the hell my father and brother had created. That the pain I felt in my body was nothing compared to the battle I'd have ahead to heal the invisible wounds that night had left on my soul. But in that moment, walking slowly through Salem streets, supported by Mrs. Teresa, feeling the sun on my face for the first time in days, I could only think one thing. "Mom, you're still taking care of me, even from up there." Mrs. Teresa's house was on the other side of town, in a more secluded neighborhood. It was a simple little house, painted yellow, with a wooden fence in front and a small but well-tended garden. So different from my house, which had always been dark and sad, especially after Mom got sick. "Here you'll be safe," she told me as she opened the door. "No one will hurt you anymore." I entered leaning on her, still feeling pain all over my body. Inside the house, everything was clean and organized. There were books everywhere, on shelves, stacked on little tables, even on windowsills. Mrs. Teresa was a teacher, and that was reflected in every corner of that home. She settled me in the guest room, which had a single bed with a flowered bedspread and a window that looked out to the back garden, where a heavily fruited apple tree swayed in the breeze. She arranged the pillows so I'd be comfortable and said she was going to prepare something for me to eat. I lay looking at the ceiling, trying to organize my thoughts. Would my father and James come looking for me? Would we be safe there? What would happen to me now that I had no more family? Mrs. Teresa returned with a tray. There was vegetable soup, still warm bread, and a glass of milk. The smell made me realize how hungry I was after days without eating properly. "We need to take you to a doctor," she said while I ate slowly. "Those marks on your body need to be documented." I stopped eating, panic overwhelming me. "I don't want anyone to know," I whispered. "I'm ashamed." She held my hand with care. "Janet, what happened to you wasn't your fault. The shame isn't yours, it's theirs. But if we want them to pay for what they did, we need evidence." Pay? I hadn't even thought about that yet. In my head, I could only think about running away, hiding. The idea of facing my father and brother, of telling other people what they had done to me, seemed more frightening than anything. "I'm scared," I confessed, tears returning to my eyes. "What if no one believes me? What if they come after us?" Mrs. Teresa took a deep breath. I saw that she was also afraid, but trying to stay strong for my sake. "Let's do this," she proposed. "First, I'll take you to a doctor, a friend of mine, Dr. Eugene, who's discreet and trustworthy. He'll examine you, make a record of the injuries. Then, depending on what he says, we'll decide the next steps." I nodded, without energy to argue. I finished eating in silence, thinking about Mom, wishing she were there to hug me and say everything would be okay. That same afternoon, Mrs. Teresa took me to Dr. Eugene's office. He was a gray-haired gentleman with kind eyes who treated me with so much respect and delicacy that it made me cry again. He examined me, took notes, took some photographs of the marks on my body, with my permission and always with Mrs. Teresa present. When he finished, he asked to speak with Mrs. Teresa privately. I waited in the examination room, wrapped in a hospital sheet, feeling cold despite the afternoon heat. I don't know exactly what they talked about, but when they returned, Mrs. Teresa had a determined expression on her face. Dr. Eugene explained that I would have to take some medications to prevent diseases and an unwanted pregnancy. The word pregnancy hit me like a punch. I hadn't even thought about that possibility yet, so immersed was I in the immediate pain. We returned to her house in silence. My head spun with confused thoughts, with fear of the future, with longing for Mom. It was already getting dark when we arrived. Mrs. Teresa helped me take the medications, settled me in bed, and said she needed to go out for an hour, but would be back soon. She left the front door locked, windows closed, and asked me not to answer if anyone knocked. I stayed alone in that unfamiliar house, listening to the night sounds beginning outside, my heart tight. Where had she gone? Had she gone to talk to my father? To the police? Fear gave way to tiredness, and I ended up falling asleep. I woke up to the sound of voices. It must have been late at night. I recognized Mrs. Teresa's voice, but there was another person with her, a male voice I couldn't identify. I strained my ears, trying to understand what they were saying. "We can't just leave like this, Jerome," Mrs. Teresa was saying. "They need to pay for what they did." Teresa, be rational," the male voice responded. "You're talking about a respected man in town, long-time factory employee. His word against a traumatized girl's. How do you think this will end?" "There are medical records, photographs, which can be explained in 1,000 ways. An accident, a fall, I don't know. You know how justice works in this town, how they protect the good men." There was silence, and then his voice continued softer. "The girl's best chance is to start over far from here. I can help you both. I have that brother in Denver, remember? He can arrange a place for you to stay until you get established." Denver? It was so far. The idea of leaving Salem, the city where I was born and raised, where my mother was buried, gave me a knot in my throat. But at the same time, the prospect of staying there, knowing that my father and James could find me at any moment. I didn't hear the rest of the conversation. I ended up sleeping again, too exhausted to keep my eyes open. The next morning, Mrs. Teresa explained the plan. Jerome was a colleague of hers from the school where she taught, one of the few men she trusted. He had a brother in Denver who worked at a large school and could help her get a job there. The idea was for us to go there, start a new life, away from those who had hurt me. But what about justice? I asked, remembering the conversation I had overheard the night before. She sighed, running her hand through my hair like Mom used to do. God's justice never fails, Janet. Men's justice, well, it's complicated. Your father knows many important people in town, has friends in the police. Jerome thinks, and I agree, that it would be your word against his. And in a small town like Salem, in 1960, she didn't need to complete the sentence. Even as a child, I understood how the world worked, how people preferred to turn a blind eye to the evil that happened inside houses, behind closed doors. But we're not leaving just like that without more, she continued. We're going to file a complaint, leave documented what happened. Maybe it won't result in anything now, but it leaves a record. And more importantly, we're going to do it in a way that your father can never find you again or claim custody over you. I didn't really understand what she meant by that at the time. Only later did I learn about the complete plan she had devised. That same day, Jerome came to pick us up in an old car. We went first to the police station, where Mrs. Teresa insisted on filing a formal complaint. The duty officer, a man with a bored expression, barely paid attention while she related the horrors that had happened to me. He wrote something in a notebook, asked us to sign a paper, and said he would investigate. I left there feeling dirty and humiliated again. It was as if no one cared, as if what had happened to me was too insignificant to deserve attention. Then we went to the courthouse. Mrs. Teresa had all my documents, birth certificate, school ID, that she had taken from my father's house. At the courthouse, she presented a paper. It's an authorization your mother signed before she died, she explained to me, giving me provisional custody of you in case something happened to her. I was surprised. I didn't know Mom had done that, but it made sense. She always worried about protecting me, even knowing she wouldn't be here anymore. The notary examined the document, stamped it, asked Mrs. Teresa to sign some papers, and thus, officially, I became her legal responsibility. It wasn't a complete adoption, that would come later, but it was enough to prevent my father from claiming me back. Our last stop was the cemetery. I needed to say goodbye to Mom before leaving. We stayed there, in front of the simple headstone that read, Jacqueline Silva, 1929-1960, beloved mother, for almost an hour. I cried all the tears I still had, talked silently with her, promised I'd be strong, that I'd survive, that I'd do everything she had dreamed for me. When we finally returned to the car, it was already getting dark. Jerome seemed anxious. We need to go, he insisted. We've spent the whole day circulating around town. If her father starts looking, it won't take long to discover you've been here. Mrs. Teresa agreed. We got in the car, and as we left Salem behind, I felt a mix of relief and sadness. I was leaving behind not just the horror of recent days, but also all the good memories of my childhood, the places I knew, the city where my mother rested. The trip to Denver would take almost a full day. I rested my head on Mrs. Teresa's shoulder and closed my eyes, exhausted. Through the car window, Salem's lights were getting more and more distant, until they completely disappeared on the horizon. A new life was beginning for me. A life without my mother, but also without the terror my father and brother represented. A life of uncertainties, but also of possibilities. Everything will be okay, Mrs. Teresa whispered, as if reading my thoughts. We're together now. And it was with that promise that I fell asleep, while the car took us away from everything I knew, toward a future I couldn't even imagine yet. Denver seemed enormous when we arrived, after that endless trip. A big, noisy city, full of tall buildings and hurried people who didn't even notice our presence. So different from the peaceful Salem I knew, where everyone knew everyone's name. Jerome's brother was named Augustus. He was a math teacher at a private school and lived in a small but cozy apartment in the Capitol Hill neighborhood. He received us with open arms, even without knowing me, without knowing exactly what had happened. His kindness reminded me that there were still good men in the world, something I was beginning to doubt. You can stay here until you find a place, he said, while showing us the guest room, which would be ours for now. I already talked to the principal of the school where I work. There's an opening for an English teacher next semester. If you want it, Teresa, the job is yours. Mrs. Teresa thanked him, visibly relieved to have a work prospect. She had savings, but they wouldn't be enough to support us for very long. The first days in Denver were a blur of confused emotions. I felt displaced, lost, as if I didn't belong anywhere. I had nightmares almost every night, woke up screaming, sweaty, reliving the horror of that night after Mom's burial. Mrs. Teresa always came running, hugged me, stayed awake with me until I could sleep again. After 2 weeks at Augustus's house, we found an apartment to rent. It was in the same neighborhood, in an old building on the 3rd floor. It had only 1 bedroom, a small living room, kitchen, and bathroom. Nothing compared to the spacious house Mrs. Teresa had in Salem, but she never complained. "It's a new beginning for both of us," she'd say, while we arranged the few things we had. We only brought clothes, some books, and my mother's photographs that we managed to save. The school semester would start in August. Mrs. Teresa soon started working at the school Augustus had recommended. I was supposed to start studying there too, but the idea of being in a place full of teenagers, having to interact, having to explain where I had come from and why I had changed schools in the middle of the year, all of this terrified me. "I'm not ready," I confessed to her one night after dinner. "I can't imagine going into a classroom with everyone looking at me." She understood. She always understood. "Let's do it differently then. This semester, I'll homeschool you. Next year, when you're feeling better, you'll go back to regular school. What do you think?" That's how I spent the following months, studying at home, with Mrs. Teresa teaching me all subjects after she came back from work. She was an incredible teacher, patient, dedicated, knew how to make even the most boring subjects interesting. Gradually, I began to truly interest myself in studies, not just out of obligation. I read all the books she recommended, did homework with effort. It was also a form of escape. While studying, I didn't think about the past, about the bad things I had lived through. During that period, Mrs. Teresa also arranged for me to visit a psychologist, Dr. Marina. At first, I hated going. I'd sit in silence in her office, answering in monosyllables, unable to talk about what had happened. "You don't need to tell everything at once," Dr. Marina told me in one of the first sessions. "Let's start talking about easier things. Tell me about your mother." And so, week after week, I began to thaw. I talked about Mom, about the good memories of childhood, about how I was adapting to Denver. Until one day, almost 6 months after starting therapy, I managed to talk about that night. The words came out like a flood, mixed with tears and sobs. When I finished, I felt exhausted, but also relieved, as if I had taken an enormous weight off my shoulders. "You're very brave, Janet," Dr. Marina told me that day. "Surviving what you survived already requires immense strength. But being able to talk about it, face this pain head-on, that's true courage." I didn't feel brave. I felt broken, damaged, as if something fundamental had been ripped from me. But her words planted a seed that years later would grow and bear fruit. Time passed. In January 1961, I turned 14. Mrs. Teresa made a small cake, bought a present, a poetry book I keep to this day, and we sang Happy Birthday, just the two of us, in our cramped little living room. It was a simple but sincere celebration, the first of many we'd have together over the years. The following year, I finally felt ready to go back to school. I entered 8th grade at the same school where Mrs. Teresa taught. It was difficult at first. I was the new student, the different one, the quiet one. But gradually, I made friends, adapted to the rhythm of classes, found my place. One classmate in particular, Clarice, became very close. She had also lost her mother, although in very different circumstances. That shared pain created a bond between us. With her, I could talk about things I didn't discuss with anyone else. "I hate when people say it will pass," Clarice commented one day while we were sitting on a bench in the school courtyard. "The longing doesn't pass. We just learn to live with it." That's exactly how I felt. The longing for Mom was a constant presence, a silent companion who walked beside me every day. It wasn't always painful. Sometimes it was just a gentle melancholy, an acute awareness of everything she had lost by leaving so early, of everything I had lost by not having her by my side. The high school years passed in a blink. I discovered I had a facility with languages and literature. I loved writing. Poems, stories, anything. It was a form of expression, of putting out feelings I couldn't always verbalize. When it came time to decide what to do after school, I had no doubts. I wanted to be a teacher, like Mrs. Teresa. I wanted to do for other children's lives what she had done for mine. Open doors, show paths, be a safe harbor. I passed the entrance exam to the University of Colorado for English in 1965. It was one of the happiest days of my life up to that point. Mrs. Teresa cried with pride when she saw my name on the acceptance list in the newspaper. "Your mother would be so proud," she said while hugging me. So proud. College opened a new world for me. I met people of all kinds, read books I had never heard of, participated in heated debates about politics, art, philosophy. Those were turbulent times in America. The Vietnam War was escalating, the civil rights movement was in full swing, and the university was one of the few spaces where ideas could still be discussed freely, even if carefully. It was there that I met Richard, in my sophomore year. He was studying law, 2 years older than me, and had the gentlest eyes I had ever seen. We met at a party organized by the student council. I was sitting in a corner, somewhat out of place as I always felt at social events, when he approached and struck up a conversation. At first, I was defensive. After what I had been through, the idea of getting romantically close to any man terrified me. But Richard was different from anyone I had ever met. Patient, respectful, never pressured me. We'd talk for hours about books, music, dreams for the future. It took me almost a year to accept going out with him alone. Our first date was at a cafe near the university. I was so nervous that I spilled coffee on the table, staining my new dress. Instead of being embarrassed, Richard laughed, not at me, but at the situation, and made me laugh too. It was the first time in a long time that I felt normal. Like any young woman, on any date, without the weight of the past crushing my shoulders. Even so, it took me a long time to tell him about what had happened in Salem. I was afraid of his reaction, afraid he'd look at me differently, with pity or disgust. When I finally found the courage, 2 years after we started dating, he simply held my hands and said, "Thank you for trusting me enough to share this. It doesn't change anything about how I feel about you." At that moment, I knew I had found someone special. We graduated in 1969, me in English, him in law. We married the following year in a small ceremony at the neighborhood church. Mrs. Teresa, whom I now called Mom, cried throughout the entire ceremony. "Two mothers bless you today," she told me. "Me from here and Jacqueline from above." Richard started working at a law firm specializing in civil rights. Dangerous work during those times, but which he did with passion and conviction. I got a job as a teacher at a public school, fulfilling the dream I'd had since adolescence. Our first child, Edward, was born in 1972. When I held him in my arms for the first time, I felt a love so great it almost didn't fit in my chest. But I also felt fear. How would I be as a mother without having had my own mother's example for so long? Would I know how to protect him, raise him right, give him all the love he deserved? Richard noticed my insecurity. "You have the best possible example," he reminded me. "You had 2 extraordinary mothers who showed you what unconditional love is. Besides, you're the strongest person I know. Our son is lucky to have you." His words calmed me. But it was really the daily experience, the contact with that little being so dependent and so full of life, that taught me to be a mother. Each smile from Edward, each discovery, each achievement, from the first tooth to the first step, was healing something inside me that I didn't even know was still broken. In 1975, our family grew with Claire's arrival. Unlike her brother, who was calm and observant, Claire was pure energy from day one. She talked early, walked early, and soon was running around the house, turning everything upside down with her insatiable curiosity. Life went on its course, with the normal joys and challenges of any family. Richard became a partner at the firm. I was promoted to curriculum coordinator at school. We bought a small but comfortable house in the Park Hill neighborhood. Mrs. Teresa, now retired, came to visit us almost every day, being the grandmother my children didn't have on their father's side. Richard's parents had died before we even met. But the past, no matter how much we try to bury it, has the habit of resurfacing when we least expect it. In 1980, almost 20 years after we had fled Salem, I received a letter. The sender was a courthouse in that city. I opened it with trembling hands, my heart racing. It was a notification. My father had died. As his daughter, I was the legal heir to his property, the house where I grew up, and a small savings account. The letter had been sent to various addresses until it found me, probably following the trail of records I had left over the years. I spent hours looking at that paper, not knowing what to feel. There was no pain, no relief, no anger, just a strange emptiness, as if I were reading about a stranger, not about the man I once called father, the man who destroyed my childhood in a single night of hatred and madness. "What do you want to do?" Richard asked when I told him. "I don't want anything that comes from him," I replied, without hesitation. Nothing. The next day, I wrote a letter formally renouncing the inheritance. I didn't want that house, those memories, that money. I didn't want any connection to that man or to the past I had left behind so long ago. The letter mentioned that my brother, James, had died years before in a car accident. I felt nothing reading that either. Those blood ties had been irreparably cut that fateful night in July 1960. My real family was different now. Richard, our children, Mrs. Teresa. People who truly loved me, who would never hurt me. Life continued its course. The children grew up, the war ended, the country changed at a slow pace. In 1990, Mrs. Teresa had a stroke. I took care of her, as she had taken care of me so many years before, with love, patience, dedication. She passed away peacefully 2 years later, holding my hand, calling me daughter, until her last breath. Burying her was like losing my mother for the second time. But unlike the first time, when I was alone with my pain, now I had an entire family supporting me, holding me up, reminding me that the love she had given me would continue to live in me, in my children, and one day, in their children. And that's how, over decades, I built a life I never imagined I would have that dark night in Salem. A life with pain and scars, yes, some that never completely disappeared, but also with so much love, so much joy, so many achievements. A life that was only possible because a brave and determined woman kept the promise she made to my mother. A life I built step by step, brick by brick, transforming trauma into strength, pain into compassion, fear into courage. You know, my dear ones, when we suffer a very great trauma in childhood, it seems like life is divided into two pieces, before and after that moment. For a long time, I thought I would forever be defined by that terrible night, that I would carry that open wound for the rest of my life. But time is a powerful medicine, and love, oh, love, is the best healer there is. When my children entered adolescence, I began to feel a different fear. Edward, at 13, reminded me so much of the age I was when I lost my mother, when everything collapsed. I started having nightmares again, becoming anxious, overprotective. "You're not going to let him breathe this way," Richard gently warned me one night after I had called 3 times to the friend's house where Edward was studying. "Our children aren't living the same story you lived." He was right, of course. But fear doesn't obey logic. That's when I decided to go back to therapy. After so many years, I needed to resolve this knot inside me, this irrational fear that my children might suffer what I suffered. The new therapist, different from Dr. Marina from my adolescence, worked with a more direct approach. "You're punishing your children for your father's crimes," she told me in one of the first sessions. "You're depriving them of the freedom and normal experiences of their age because of your fear." That hit me like lightning. It was exactly what I was doing. And it wasn't fair to them. "How can I overcome this?" I asked, desperate for a solution. "By recognizing that your story isn't their destiny, that you broke the cycle, that the home you and Richard built is safe, loving, healthy." It was a slow process, sometimes painful, but liberating. I began to loosen the reins gradually. I let Edward go to school alone, allowed Claire to sleep over at friends' houses. Each small independence I granted them was also a gift to myself, the gradual liberation from the fear that imprisoned me. In 1992, I made a decision that would change the course of my professional life. After more than 20 years as a teacher and coordinator, I decided to go back to university for a master's in education. Richard supported me unconditionally, as always. "It's never too late to follow dreams," he'd say. At 45, I became a student again. It was strange at first, being one of the older students in the class, but I soon adapted. My thesis was about the impact of childhood trauma on educational development, a topic I knew intimately, not just from books, but from my own experience. It was during the research for my master's that I had an epiphany. Talking with educators, psychologists, and social workers, I realized how many children went through situations of abuse without anyone intervening, without having a Mrs. Teresa to save them. I thought about my own story and how it could have been different if someone, a teacher, a neighbor, any adult, had noticed the signs before. After completing my master's in 1994, I didn't go back to school. Instead, I started working with the Municipal Department of Education, developing training programs for teachers to identify signs of abuse and domestic violence. It was work that I was passionate about, that gave purpose to all the pain I had lived through. "You transformed your wound into a mission," Richard commented proudly, after watching me conduct a workshop for municipal school principals. But it wasn't just at work that I found purpose. My greatest achievement, my greatest pride, was my family. Seeing my children grow up healthy, secure, loved. It was living proof that I had managed to break the cycle of violence, that the past didn't need to determine the future. Edward graduated from medical school in 1996. Seeing my son in a white coat, ready to care for and heal others, filled me with a pride I can't even describe. Claire chose a different path. Always artistic and creative, she decided to study film and became a documentary filmmaker. Her films about social issues won awards at festivals throughout America. In 1998, Edward gave us our first grandchild, Michael. Holding him in my arms for the first time was like closing a circle, like receiving confirmation that, despite everything, life had been worth it. "Grandma, tell story," he'd ask when he started talking. And I would tell. Invented stories, fairy tales, American legends. The same stories my mother Jacqueline told me, that Mrs. Teresa continued telling, and that I now passed on, keeping alive this chain of love that crossed generations. Claire gave me 2 more grandchildren, the twins Louise and Teresa, born in 2003. Yes, one of them received the name of that extraordinary woman who saved my life. When Claire told me she was pregnant with twins and that one of them would be called Teresa, I cried like I hadn't cried in years. "She deserves this tribute," Claire explained. "Without her, I wouldn't even exist." It was true. Without Mrs. Teresa's courage and determination, I probably wouldn't have survived those terrible days. I wouldn't have met Richard, wouldn't have had my children, wouldn't be here today telling this story to you. In 2005, Richard was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. It was as if the ground had disappeared from under my feet. He, who had always been my safe harbor, my rock, now needed me to be strong for both of us. The battle lasted almost 2 years. Chemotherapy, radiation, surgeries. We fought with all available weapons. We took turns at the hospital. Me, Edward, Claire, even the older grandchildren. We didn't leave him alone for a minute. "You didn't give up on living after everything you went through," he told me one night in the hospital, during one of his rare improvements. "You taught me that we can always start over, no matter how difficult it seems." Now I'm trying to remember that lesson. But some battles we can't win, no matter how hard we fight. Richard passed away on a June morning in 2007 at home, as he had asked, holding my hand and with our children around him. His last word was my name. The grief for Richard was different from all the others I had lived through. It didn't have the horror that accompanied my mother's loss, nor the emotional complexity when I learned of my father's death, nor even the deep but serene sadness of Mrs. Teresa's departure. It was a clean, pure pain, born from a love that had lasted almost 4 decades, a love that had healed me, transformed me, allowed me to be the person I could have been if trauma hadn't interrupted my childhood. In the months that followed, I found comfort in my children, my grandchildren, the work I continued to do. Gradually, I learned to live without Richard, to carry him in my heart without the physical absence being a constant pain. In 2010, at 63, I officially retired. But I didn't stop working. I started giving lectures at schools, universities, community centers. I talked about education, about signs of abuse, about the importance of attentive adults in the lives of vulnerable children. I didn't tell my personal story. I wasn't ready for that yet. But everything I said was informed by it. That same year, Claire surprised me with a gift that would change my life again. "Mom, I want to make a documentary about Mrs. Teresa," she announced during a Sunday lunch. "About women like her, who save lives silently, without recognition." The idea moved me deeply. Mrs. Teresa deserved to be remembered, celebrated. Her courage and kindness deserved to be known by the world. The documentary, Invisible Angels, was released in 2012 and won several awards. It told the story of 5 women who, like Mrs. Teresa, had risked everything to protect children at risk. My story was there, told not by me, but by Claire, with respect and sensitivity. It was the first time people outside the closest family circle knew what had happened to me in Salem so many years ago. After the release, something unexpected happened. I started receiving letters, emails, messages from people who had seen the documentary and identified with my story. Women and men who had gone through similar situations, who carried similar scars, who wanted to share their experiences, their healing journeys. It was overwhelming at first. I wasn't prepared for that flood of emotions, for the weight of so many painful stories. But gradually, I realized that this was also a gift, an opportunity to transform my experience into something that could help others, just like the work I already did, but in a more direct, more personal way. I started responding to each message individually. Then, I accepted invitations to participate in support groups, to share my story at survivor meetings. It was painful sometimes, reliving those memories, but also incredibly liberating. "You saved my life today," a 20-year-old young woman told me after one of those meetings. "I thought it would never be possible to have a normal life after what I went through. But looking at you, seeing everything you built, I realize it's possible." Those words moved me deeply. I realized that my story of pain had transformed into a story of hope for others. That Mrs. Teresa's legacy continued to live not only in my children and grandchildren, but in each person who found strength in my journey to continue their own. In 2015, at 68, I wrote a book. It wasn't a complete autobiography, but an account of my experience as a survivor and the work I had developed over the decades. After the Storm became a small phenomenon, translated into several languages, used in psychology and social work courses. Today, at 78, I look back and see a life I never imagined I would have. A full, rich, meaningful life. I have 2 extraordinary children, 5 wonderful grandchildren. Yes, 2 more came after the twins, and even a newborn great-granddaughter, little Jacqueline, in honor of my mother. I live alone, in a comfortable house, full of books and photographs. Richard is missed every day, of course, but I learned to live with the longing. My children and grandchildren visit me constantly, filling the house with life and noise. The broken girl from Salem, who thought she would never be whole again, built a full life, a loving family, a legacy of protection and care, not despite the trauma, but transforming it into strength, into purpose, into love. I never went back to Salem. I didn't want to. Some bridges don't need to be rebuilt. But I forgave, not for them, who never asked for forgiveness, but for me. Because hatred is too heavy a burden to carry for a lifetime. The promise I made to my mother in that cemetery before leaving for Denver was kept. I survived. I became strong. I built a life she would be proud to see. And most importantly, I broke the cycle. My children, my grandchildren, my great-granddaughter, none of them will know from personal experience the kind of horror I knew. They grew up and will grow up surrounded by love, respect, security. This is my greatest victory, my greatest legacy. My dear ones who are watching me today, if this story touched your heart, please leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Each subscription gives me strength to continue sharing these memories, which aren't always easy to relive, but which can help someone going through difficult times. And don't forget to comment where you're watching from. Each comment brings me closer to each one of you, and knowing that my story reaches different places, different hearts, fills me with joy and purpose. A warm hug from Grandma Janet, who learned that the scars we carry don't define who we are, but what we choose to do with them does. Remember always, the greatest revenge against those who tried to destroy you is to live a full, happy, and meaningful life. That's what I did, and that's what I wish for each one of you.